Okay, this is a quick review video of the lecture that I presented in class. And I'm focusing specifically on the grid concepts that we'll be dealing with in this part of the project. So as you recall, you might want to just go ahead and read the function of the grid, right? Impose a structure, create hierarchy, provide visual paths, relay content by size, proportion, and spatial configuration, guarantee layout consistency. That's what we're really thinking about here. We're doing multiple pages and documents. We are also thinking about not so much about the layouts of products in a series, but we'll get to that. And then, of course, remember that the grid is a tool. It's not a guarantee, and you need to practice to get good at it, okay? So, that is not what I wanted. I want to show single page. So remember, we talked about the parts of the grid and the parts of the page, right? So remember, you're always going to want to have margins unless you intentionally want to have a bleed. You might consider the idea of a flow line, since we're dealing with 3 different ads. Having a flow line between them might be something to think about, but because the concept of this is that the 3 ads would not necessarily be seen next to each other, but more or less sequentially. But even then, even in your portfolio, you might consider having a consistent element. Now, we'll talk more about this when we get into publication design, but it's something to think about. Remember that we have modules, and we have spatial zones. We have columns, right? These are informal grids. Okay, so you can play around with informal grids, and you can create an informal grid by simply laying out your elements and then aligning them using the implied grid, which then becomes an informal grid, and then you can use that same grid throughout your other 2 designs. So that's a way of approaching an informal grid, and I encourage you to explore that. We have formal grids. Remember that even though we have a formal grid like something like this, you may want to include alleys in your layout if your content has text that's going to have columns. Now, we don't have much text in this particular project, so it might be okay to simply run with a design like this and then put your images and your text in a grid like this. This is a formal grid, right? Remember, formal grids are mathematically divided, right? So we have a division of 3 and a division of 5, 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. Modular grid, these are always kind of fun. A couple of different styles of modular grids. Again, in this project, I kind of encourage you to run with this sort of grid. It creates for what we're doing here, I think it's the easiest kind of grid to use because it does give you columns and rows, and it allows you to play with the spatial zones in a formal way. In other words, you have your zone, you have your module, you have your spatial zone, and so those are things that you might, it just gives you a lot of structure, okay? Having a highly stratified grid can be something that's very useful because your spatial zones become more complex and it allows multiple ways of handling it. In the next video where I show you some sample projects, you'll see some designs that use highly stratified formal grids that really are very, very effective. So after you see the samples, you might get an idea of, how you might do that, okay? Remember, you've got your margin and you have your active space, okay? So just keep that in mind. Remember, you've got your module and you have an active corner and a passive corner. Now, it's not that the upper left corner is always the active corner and the lower right is always passive. Any corner can be active. It's the opposite corner that's passive. So this could be an active corner here. And then if the design is, if the element is not the same size as the module, then you pull it down from this side so that it fits 3 of the 4 sides. Okay, so active corner can be anywhere. The passive corner is the opposite corner. Okay, so if we use a 9x9 grid, this is an example of an active formal grid. The active grid uses the entire module and or the spatial zone. Okay, and remember that if something is if your element is not the same size as your module, it has to touch 3 of the 4 sides in an active grid. Okay, so if it's shorter, it touches the left, right, and bottom, and or left, right, and top. And if it's narrow, it touches the top, right, and bottom. Okay, so an inactive grid suggests but doesn't direct. In other words, if this were going to be an active grid, has an active corner, and then this is the passive corner and it's been pulled in. Here's the active corner. The passive corner has been pulled in. This is the active corner here and it's been pulled in. Now this is a situation where you can break the rule. And the reason why is because the grid is a less strong alignment than the other elements. So say you've already scaled these 2 elements and you like the way that looks, then it doesn't make sense to force the grid onto the content. The inactive grid says it suggests where to put it, but it doesn't direct. And in this case, it suggests moving it to the left, but keeping the top and the bottom aligned with the other 2 graphics, okay? So inactive grids are way more flexible than active grids, and they come with a little bit more responsibility because they can be, used badly. Lots of ideas about using that 9x9 grid. Now, this is going to be an ad, so it'd be a 9x12. It'd be a 3x4 if you were using this kind of design. But it's not, the concept is exactly the same. Remember, you have negative space and you have positive space. You can have large spatial zones, or you can have module zones, right? So consider that there's a lot of different ways that we can handle putting stuff into the grid. All right, here's a good example of a 4x5 and a lot of the different ways that can be handled. Again, I kind of like the idea of sketching things out, but it's not required. But you always see that, how this can work. Now, in what we're doing in this project, it's probably easier because we're going to be dealing with, a specific number of images and a specific headline and so on. Just as easy probably to do this using digital, right? Just basically create your grid and start playing around with putting it into different zones, using different sizes of elements and so on, okay? Remember, these are some of the things that you can use. We'll get more into this when we start getting into layout, but these are some things that you could think about as you begin to play with the ads. You'll always have a headline. You might have a subheadline. You could potentially have captions. You could potentially have callouts. So there are some things that you might consider, but again, we'll probably get more, we will get more into this when we get into magazine design. So these are some things that I just want to throw out there. We'll revisit these later. Okay, so that's the grid in a nutshell, just a quick review, and these are the concepts that we'll be dealing, or at least focusing on, in this phase of the project, okay? Alrighty.